Good day and welcome to 2015 in Review, the big trends impacting 2016 webinar. In this, we're going to review the performance of pharma in 2015, highlight some of the challenges companies are facing, and discuss how they might actually react to those challenges. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join today's webinar. Before we get started, I just want to review a few housekeeping items, and then we can let you know how to participate in today's webinar. First, you should have a control panel on the right side of your screen. Towards the bottom of the control panel is the Q&A panel. You may submit questions or comments in writing using the Q&A panel during the presentation. All answers to your questions will be answered after the webinar by email. You may also comment live using the Twitter #ScripQS handle. That's there on the screen and will appear on some of the other slides as well. So that's #ScripQS. Today's webinar is being recorded, and everyone will receive an email with a link to view a recording of today's event. My name is Mike Ward, and I'm the Global Director of Content for Informa's Pharma Intelligence and Sites portfolio. That includes such iconic brands as Scrip Intelligence, Pig Sheep, and Invivo. I've been covering the pharmaceutical and biotech industries as a journalist and an analyst for more than 3 decades, and it will be my task for the next 45 minutes or so to moderate this panel. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to invite my fellow panelists to introduce themselves. So if we start with you, Tijana.
Hello everyone, my name is Tijana Ignjatovic and I'm the lead analyst for market access within Datamonitor Healthcare, the syndicated analytic business intelligence provider for the pharmaceutical industry. I have been covering the industry for almost 9 years, and I oversee all the analysis relating to market access and strategic issues within the industry, and that includes anything relating to pricing reimbursement, payer research, pharma, deal-making trends, R&D strategies, and generics investments.
Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Lloyd. I'm the Senior Director for Pharmaprojects and Data Integration for Citeline. So Pharmaprojects is Citeline's drug R&D pipeline intelligence offering. It's the original drug R&D pipeline database going all the way back to 1980, and I've actually been working on it myself since 1987, so I have almost 30 years of experience tracking drugs in R&D. The other Citeline offerings you may be familiar with are TrialTrove, the database of trials, and SiteTrove covering investigators and site. I've also been the author of the Pharma R&D Review report, which we've been producing, and I've been authoring that for about 20 years, and some of the data you'll see today will be based on this year's report.
Great, thanks Ian.
Hello everybody, I'm Jo Shorthouse and I am the Features Editor on Scrip Intelligence. I've been covering the pharma industry and the clinical trials industry and the pharma outsourcing industry for the last 8 years. It's my role on Scrip to ensure that we publish original features that really answer the key questions and challenges that our readers may have. This could be in the form of things such as videos or infographics, written features or reports from some of our intelligence products such as Citeline, Datamonitor Healthcare, Biomed Tracker or MidTrack. As part of my job, I also publish the Scrip 100, which is our annual guide to the performance and prospects of the global pharmaceutical industry, and it includes the Scrip 100 league tables, which identifies and ranks the top 100 performers in terms of pharma sales.
Great, thanks very much, Jo. So as you can see, we've brought together a panel of experts who have been looking at this industry for a number of years, and it's a sort of the distillation of our thoughts that we're going to be presenting today. So 5 years ago, we ran a similar webinar, and at that time, the discussion focused on how the pharma industry was going to cope with what was the looming patent cliff at the time. Tens of billions of dollars of drug revenue were at risk as blockbuster products approached patent expiry, and lucrative franchises were vulnerable to generic competition. Some of those responses included an increased focus on specialty and orphan medicines, greater reliance on biologicals, withdrawal from some therapeutic areas, and further consolidation and cost cutting. What has happened since then has been a mixed bag. While there's been some notable advances on the regulatory, scientific and capital market fronts, the top tier companies are still feeling the strain. In 2015, only 3 of the top 10 pharma companies actually saw drug sales increase year on year. In the past 5 years, total drugs sales at top 10 pharma companies have more or less stagnated at some $340 billion. What we've got here are some of the recent headlines from our Insight products, which show that the industry is not out of the woods. Rare diseases are not necessarily the pot of gold that some companies might have hoped for, and more importantly, the price of new drugs is becoming a major issue for politicians. So indeed, at this year's JP Morgan healthcare meeting, which takes place in January, the mood among delegates was gloomier than in recent years. The biggest dark cloud on the horizon is the fact that pricing and reimbursement is now a major issue in the US presidential primaries. While pharma's reputation among patient advocacy groups has been improving in recent years, albeit from a low base 5 years ago, its image among the general public and politicians has been tarnished by some high-profile instances of drug price increases that have attracted accusations of price gouging. The pricing reimbursement issue is not going to go away, as we can tell by this, some of the headlines that were associated with the JP Morgan meeting. And we're not actually sure that the industry has actually even come to grips or really come to grips with this challenge. Listening to the top pharma execs at JP Morgan, it was clear that some dismissed the challenge as isolated cases from rogue operators. And yet, as we've seen by the lackluster launch performances of the PCSK9 drugs, which were touted as potential blockbusters, failure to articulate a compelling value for money narrative has been very damaging. While in the past, pharma companies only needed to worry about demonstrating safety and efficacy for their compounds, going forward, they will need to demonstrate genuine cost effectiveness and meaningful clinical outcomes. This is a new challenge which we will have to sort of deal with. Of course, the perennial problem for the industry has been R&D productivity. Are pharma companies able to develop new and exciting drugs? Ian, how is actually the industry doing on this front?
Yeah, so on the left-hand graph, you can see the total number of drugs in the pipeline year by year. And by pipeline here, we're talking all the way from preclinical development through the various phases of clinical trials, registration, and it also includes drugs which are launched but are still in development for further indications and for further markets. So you can see the headline figure from our report in January this year was 13,718. This actually represents a massive 11.5% year-on-year increase from the previous year, beating the 8.8% we saw in the year before.
So Ian, so what we're seeing here, that doesn't represent 14,000 new compounds. That's 14,000 different clinical trials.
No, that's 14,000 different compounds or reformulations of existing compounds, but not generics. So these are therapeutic advances of one sort or another. And in fact, I looked at the data just before this meeting, and the figure for today, because as I mentioned, this was produced for a report in January, has already gone up to 14,336. So it looks like the pace of increase is accelerating, if anything. So of course, this could be viewed as a good thing, more drugs in the pipeline. And if actually we break it down by phase, we can see it's not just being brought around by a whole load of extra preclinical drugs. There are increases across all the different phases. Drugs at the phase 1 stage of development increased by 11.4%, at phase 2 by 5.1%, and phase 3 by 18.1%. And this is really good for 2 reasons. First of all, phase 3 has been the status at which things have not been increasing so rapidly in recent years. It was fairly flat for a number of years. So to see this actually outpace the overall increase is really good. And secondly, of course, drugs, we need more drugs at the later stages of development because these will be the drugs which hit market tomorrow.
Yeah, and actually, how is this though translating into new medicines? Are we seeing more new active substances getting approved?
Well, the answer to that is yes, probably a bit. So if we look at the number of new active substances, so new drugs and novel vaccines that were launched during 2015, we saw 46 breaking down to 43 NMEs and 3 vaccines. So this is pretty good, and it's kind of similar to what we saw in 2010 to 2013 and in 2014. And probably if you draw a line of best fit, then you can see an increase going up from around 2007. What it isn't as good as is 2014, where we saw a quite extraordinary year with 57 NMEs and 6 vaccines. So people got terribly excited this time last year that, we're really breaking through some kind of sound barrier on this. In actual fact, it looks as if 2014 was somewhat anomalous for a couple of reasons. The first one was a whole load of new drugs for hepatitis C, which were all approved during that 1 year. So this represented really a paradigm shift in the way this disease was treated, and really a whole new market opening for small molecule combination therapies. Probably the biggest change in the way a disease has been treated that we've seen since the introduction of HAART for HIV in the mid-90s. And that wasn't followed up by a similar number of new drugs in the year just gone. And the second reason was there was an unusually large amount of approvals in Japan brought about by regulatory changes in that market, which meant there was kind of a bit of a traffic jam of drugs waiting for approval, which all came through in 2014. So I don't think we can expect to see the number of drugs approved each year hitting the 60s again, but if it still keeps climbing in the upper 40s, I think things are improving. It's clearly not accelerating at the same rate as the number of drugs in R&D. So at the moment, I think we're still in a situation where increase in spend is outpacing increase in money being recouped from launched drugs.
No, and I mean, on this slide, you've also got the total number of R&D companies. So this is companies who have at least one molecule in a clinical trial?
That's right, yeah. So you can see on the right-hand side, this again has been going up year by year. And going back to 2001, you can see the number of drugs involved in R&D has tripled pretty much, which is I think, quite extraordinary. So the 3,687 you see companies involved in R&D, that's a 12.2% increase. That's actually an even bigger increase in the number of drugs, which I think represents a lot of capital being out there for new companies coming along.
Yeah, I guess the fact that access to capital for biotechs in recent years has actually been much easier, and therefore prompted this increase in R&D companies. But we now suspect that actually capital formation is going to be slightly trickier. So might we see a sort of a slowdown in the increase?
Yeah, and if we go to the next slide, we've got some information about some of the big companies and the small companies. So one of the things that I like to point out is that 56% of those 3,600 odd companies we saw earlier on are companies with just 1 or 2 drugs in their pipeline. So as you suggest, these are startups or very much niche companies, the kind of companies that maybe are looking at orphan indications and maybe never going to be marketing drugs by themselves. They could be acquired, or they could be seeking to license their drugs out to the big boys.
So, and how successful are those in terms of the attrition rates? The fact they've got 1 or 2 assets, because that sounds like it's a binary event for those companies. If they fail, their history.
Yeah, well, I mean, this number's going up again extraordinarily year on year. But I think, as you say, if the money's starting to dry up, we might see this start to tail off. So it'll be really interesting to come back next year and see whether we've seen that for the first time, because it's one of those things where it goes up every year and it goes up by more every year. Or at least that's what we've seen in the past 10 to 15 years.
Right, and so with the increase of number of companies engaged in clinical research, the big guys, what is their sort of share of voice, overall?
Yeah, so on the table on the left-hand side, you can see this year's top 10 companies by the number of drugs they have in their pipelines. So you can see GlaxoSmithKline holding on to the top spot, but actually with slightly fewer drugs than it had this time last year, and the same is true for Novartis. And actually, if we look at the top 25 companies as a whole, they now account for 14.8% of all drugs. And this is very, very slightly down. And again, year on year, we've seen this figure come down very, very slightly. So what this indicates really is the top 25 companies starting to lose a little bit of share of the pie. And at the other end of the scale, we're seeing more and more of these smaller and niche new companies. We're also seeing the big companies narrow their therapeutic focus and go increasingly more for orphan diseases. Another interesting thing to point out is we also look at where companies are headquartered in terms of where R&D is occurring. What we saw last year was a big increase in the number of companies headquartered in China. And actually, for the very first time, there are more companies doing R&D, so not generics companies, R&D companies in China than any of the other Asian countries. So Japan was previously the leader and South Korea was second. We expected China to overtake South Korea last year, but actually it went even further. So real indication that this is an emerging power in R&D.
And are they doing just clinical trials in China, or do we still think that they're going to become global players?
Well, a lot of Chinese companies now do have kind of US and European branches. So I think while it's true that a lot of that research is still just happening in China now, you'll see it kind of go out to other countries. But also, I think it's worth pointing out that until a few years ago, most of the pharma industry in China wasn't doing original R&D on what you would call traditional Western drugs. There was a lot of traditional stuff, but this is quite a new thing.
Okay, so given the increased emphasis of organ diseases, with these sort of little biotechs, do you have any sort of visibility on whether these companies are actually progressing their programs further in clinical development themselves and actually holding on to the assets longer, or are they having to sort of still create early commercial partnerships and R&D partnerships?
I think it's the latter. Most of these concerns are really far too small. Right? I mentioned they have 1 or 2 drugs, so that can be number of employees probably fewer than 100. There are certain companies that are covered on there which have 1 or 2 people, who've just taken some IP and are developing a drug almost in the garden shed, if you like.
Yeah. So Joe, I guess there are no surprises here, but do you have some thoughts on how this league table might develop in the coming years?
Yeah, sure. As part of our ongoing Scrip 100 data pool, we've got some data here that's yet to be published actually, but in it we see that the R&D spend for these companies in 2015 is still coming from the top 10 players. So there's really there's no surprises in terms of the kind of companies that we see at the very top, at the top 10. However, there is a change at the top. On the data we see on the slide, in 2014 we see that Roche is at number 1. In 2015 we see that Novartis moves from number 3 to the top spot, with Roche going down to number 2, and Pfizer is actually down to number 3 in terms of R&D spend. We've got a little bit of slight shuffling in the middle of the pack with companies like GSK, Sanofi, AstraZeneca, J&J and Merck slightly reordering themselves. But the most interesting move to me is Bristol Myers Squibb. It's moved from 10th position, as you see on the slide there, in 2014 to number 7 in 2015. So that's quite a large jump for 3 places, which is actually no surprise when you see that it's trying to narrow its therapeutic focus and it's making efforts in that field. At the end of 2015, it sold its HIV portfolio to Viv Healthcare for 350 million, and it's kind of openly said that 2 of the therapeutic areas it thinks it can make the biggest leap into is oncology and immuno-oncology.
Right, yeah, so I guess so some of the changes that we're going to see going forward is this big emphasis on immuno-oncology.
Yeah, so before we look at immuno-oncology, let's take a look at the broader therapeutic areas. So what you can see on the graph on the left-hand side is the kind of major therapeutic areas and the number of drugs in the pipeline for each. We have 2015 in the kind of purpley colour and 2016 in the orangey colour. So you can see to kind of produce that 11.5% increase in the pipeline as a whole, there have been increases across all the different therapeutic areas, but the increases vary considerably. And cancer is not only the top one, it's also got one of the biggest increases. There's now 1 in 3 of all drugs in development have at least one oncological indication. This is 1 in 5 20 years ago, so that's a huge shift, I think. Some of the disease areas which are losing share, so they have increases which are below the average, are CNS, which has really struggled to produce new drugs recently, cardiovascular and infectious diseases. And actually, if we break that data down by individual disease, you'll see 13 of the top 20 diseases are cancer. So the single most common disease for drugs to be developed against is breast cancer, followed by non-small cell lung cancer, then colorectal, and pancreatic.
Okay, so I mean, you mentioned about the rise of China. I mean, do we have any sort of visibility on where these trials are taking place, and is there any sort of, again, sort of shift in the balance of power?
Yeah, it's not. The data's not shown here, but we do have a breakdown by the territories that drugs are being developed in, and we'll see the US is by far the biggest one, accounting for about half of all companies. There's some slight changes, but not really hugely significant. So although we've seen more companies in China, the amount of drug development taking place there as a percentage of it globally, it hasn't really changed very much, although it's creeping up.
Right. Okay. And this explosion in cancer trials that we're seeing, you know, is this around sort of the excitement associated with sort of the advances in the immuno-oncology space?
Yeah. So first of all, on the right-hand side, you can see the breakdown between biotech and non-biotech drugs, and then now moving on to look at immuno-oncology. So obviously, immuno-oncology is kind of the hottest of the hot areas at the moment. And you can see here why Joe was pointing out Bristol Myers Squibb's big increase in R&D. You can see it's by far the biggest participator or sponsor of immuno-oncology trials. And you can see that also it's covering a wide number of different diseases broken down there by the different colours in the bar. And also to give you a sense of how immuno-oncology is exploding, the graph on the right-hand side shows the number of deals that we've been reporting between companies developing immuno-oncology drugs. So it's pretty flat from 2011, 2012, 2013, and leapt up in 2014 and in 2015. And there are now actually over 400 different agents which could be called immuno-oncology drugs in the pipeline.
Right. So I mean, given the fact that there is this increase in developing combinations associated with immuno-oncology, can we assume that this number is actually going to continue to grow as the leading companies are, the people who are trading by Bristol Myers, look to find companion assets that they would actually want to test in tandem with their own lead programs? Absolutely,
yeah. A lot of these trials are combination trials, and at the moment we don't see any evidence of this slowing down. In fact, the rate of acceleration is increasing at the moment, and pharma companies do tend to behave somewhat pack-like, I think, and this is certainly the way that everyone's rushing at the moment.
Right. Okay. I'd just like to remind the audience that you can comment live using the hashtag ScripQS Twitter hashtag. So, I mean, this is all very exciting, but given the cost of some of these new treatments, are we in danger of making healthcare unsustainable? Tijana.
Yeah, sure. So, if you look at oncology drug management, traditionally in the US, it's been tightly managed in the sense that most insurers have prioritization requirements in place in order for the patients to access these drugs. But you actually look at the criteria that are used in the prioritizations, they are not really restricting prescribers' choice. They are within the FDA label, and also the legal requirement to cover use covered within compendia means that lots of oncologists can actually prescribe these drugs off-label as long as their use has some evidence behind it. And when we speak to payers, clearly they are frustrated with the rising costs. Oncology drug spend increase is really at top of their mind, not just because the prices are high, but because they're used for longer, with longer survival, and also there is the issue of financial toxicity for the patients through the out-of-pocket costs. But they feel the hands are tied. They have to cover whichever cancer drug gets the FDA label. And the only way that they can really foresee any change is if there is KOL support for it. So if the physicians and the KOL supported, then maybe possibly these access could be a bit more restricted in the future. But before that happens, I think one of the interesting developments in 2015 is that in the US we've had 3 different drug value frameworks being launched for oncology drugs specifically. First is the ASCO value framework, then the NCCN evidence blocks that they put out for several indications, and also Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. They together with Real Endpoints, produced the drug abacus tool, which calculates the drug's price relative to the value it brings to the treatment. So all of a sudden we have these independent organizations which are looking at the outcomes that these drugs bring, and bringing in the price into the equation as well. So looking at this value, what is the outcome you get for this price? And if we see, one scenario we can see playing out is that the physicians and the KOLs start to reference these value-based frameworks. They're not, perfect at the moment, but as they evolve, they may become a bigger influencer in how the physicians choose their drugs, and also the payers will start referencing in the future.
So how are pharmaceutical companies sort of dealing in this new ecosystem?
So I think what's really important is understanding how these key frameworks and tools working, how are they setting these drugs, and being able to provide the evidence that maximizes their drugs' chances of being rated highly. So it's really down to the evidence base. And if you look at some other broader healthcare initiatives that are also likely to impact oncology in more the near term, we can look at oncology pathways, accountable care organizations, and one payments. And then they also converge back to this issue of what's the evidence base. Specifically, oncology pathways. These are clinical care pathways developed by physicians working with third-party organizations that are very much evidence-driven. They tend to look at the evidence that's available for a drug, what the efficacy, then what's the safety for a drug, and finally what's the price. And they, some of these tools actually, they rate the drugs based on the evidence base they have in a particular patient subpopulation. And we are increasingly seeing some of the large insurance carriers contracting with these third-party providers, or using their tools to contract with the providers to say, okay, if we select these highest performance drugs and rate them as on pathway, you will be incentivized financially to stick to on-pathway drugs for a certain percentage of your patients. And effectively, that means that some drugs will gain higher market share if they're rated higher by these, or as the best treatment within the oncology pathways. It doesn't mean that their effect will be negative. If the drug has the best evidence base, it actually boosts its use.
So how does this translate to pricing pressures in the US then?
So essentially, it sort of comes back to this growing cost of treating oncology. But I think what's been dominating the news a bit more, and you may say they're outliers, but they certainly have brought the focus on pricing. It has been the case of excessive drug price hikes. We've seen the Turing-Strelli case dominate the headlines and getting the legislators' attention. And you may be asking, is a new drug price regulation on the horizon? Certainly, the Democratic candidates have come out with their own price control bills. But in reality, if you have a Democratic president, will they actually introduce a drug price legislation on their own? They can't do that, and they can't really do it without support from the Senate and the Congress. And we think that the other legislators will be more focused on the Healthcare Reform Act. But what it does bring into the public eye is this pressure on price, the visibility of it, and what we see is increasingly the public support. And I think that's a much bigger risk. If the public support for drug price regulation continues to increase the way it has up to now, then this really brings the real risk. So either the industry sort of has to start to self-regulate, so to speak, on how they price the drugs, or this may happen. Had you asked us this 5 years ago, we would have said no way, but now we're not so sure of that. So in terms of what's going to happen in the meantime, before potentially any legislation comes out, well, the drug value frameworks are going to have more and more influence. We've discussed those, and also the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. They've started to publish their assessments, and the payers may not reference these officially, but they will certainly look at them and say, okay, if the ICE is saying that this drug is overpriced by 50%, this is going to play a role in their contracting negotiation. So the industry really needs to pay attention for what evidence also these independent frameworks are requiring. And one of the sort of also important events from 2015 that I think we need to pay attention to in 2016 are the outcome-based reimbursement deals. They've been fairly rare in the US in the past, but we've had clearly the PCSK9 deal with Amgen and Harvard Pilgrim, and we've now recently had one Entresto, and I think that all points to the fact that they will not be as rare as they were before. Clearly, there's appetite both on the industry side and on the payer side to engage more in them. But in terms of will they become more common, like very common and replace contracting, we don't think so. I mean, these are quite high administrative burden deals. Surely the smaller insurers are unlikely to want to go for them unless they have a particularly good infrastructure and links between their claims and also electronic medical records data. But it would be interesting to see how actually insurance and the industry also experiment with these deals. You know, there's a bit more inexperience with them in the US. How do you define a hospitalization that's linked clearly to heart failure? How do you sort of remove those ambiguities? I think this will be an interesting thing to see how things play out. And also, you know, will the industry and the US payers also apply some of the learnings from European experience? In Europe, we've had the risk-sharing deals for longer. There have been some successes and some failures, and you know, we've seen lots of them in oncology. We don't see that in the US there. You know, we wonder, are we going to see any convergence also in terms of how long these deals go for? We expect to see experimentation in the US.
Right. I mean, and does it mean that you know, companies who've actually, you know, traditionally had more exposure to European markets are going to get some, you know, potential advantage going forward?
Potentially, because clearly if they've been used to providing a very strong evidence base and also health economics and outcomes data to the European payers, you know, they may end up identifying those payer archetypes that they can expect the US payers to be paid more like in the future. We're definitely seeing convergence between Europe and the US in terms of reimbursement. And you know, Europe has not been accustomed to cost containment for a longer period of time, and if you look at some of the events from the last couple of years, clearly that trend is continuing. In the UK, one of the key events has been the reform of the Cancer Drug Fund that's going to happen or come into effect this year. And Cancer Drugs Fund has really been a sticking plaster for oncology market access in the UK for a number of years now, and that's set to change. Under the current proposal or decision, it's going to become a managed access fund with clear entry and exit criteria, and what that really means that some of the drugs that are covered under it would likely be delisted, and in the future the drugs that will get covered by the cancer drug funds will be those that the NICE said no to, but not just because there's a price is too high, but because there is an uncertainty in the evidence base and maybe not quite clear what the survival rates are because of the crossover clinical trial design, and you know, I don't think that's going to just put extra pressure on the pricing in the UK, and we've clearly seen lots of negative reactions through the industry around that. If you look at France has generally been quite much more generous in reimbursement compared to the UK, but since 2013 there is a requirement for the drugs that have added benefit level of 3 or higher to undergo economic evaluation. And there's been a big question when that was launched, you know, is this going to become French-licensed? And that has not happened, but clearly these evaluations do impact into the price negotiation with SEPs and just underline really the appetite for the health economic data that is growing in all the markets, really.
Right. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking, so with these evaluations, I mean, are we sort of seeing sort of changes in the way that companies are devising their clinical trials, so that in fact they're not just looking against placebo, but actually having to now do more comparative trials with, you know, to get this, you know, our compound, our drug is better than the competitor?
We certainly see that lots of companies are paying more attention to what endpoints are used, and that the endpoints are not just the ones that the clinicians will want to see, but also that the payers will want to see. You know, so one of the examples is the interleukin-5 inhibitors in asthma, such as Nucala and the other IL-5s, and they all have this impact not just on exacerbations but also on hospitalizations. And clearly, this is pretty much, you know, hospitalizations and ER visits is the #1 endpoint for payers. So we do see progress. It's not to say that there's still not oncology trials that have wrong comparators in it, and I think, you know, this is clearly not seen very positively by clinicians or the payers. If you look at some other key events to look out for in 2016, I'd really like to pick out Germany. You know, AMNOG law has been dominating the German headlines since 2011 and really impacted the pricing in the country. But there are signs that potentially it will be reformed this year. And one of the major changes will be the change to this mixed price that they're calculating. Under AMLO, early benefit assessment, including the GBS, says drugs benefits in multiple subpopulations, and then the final price is negotiated depending on what added benefit they have in what subpopulations. And we have on occasion seen drugs that have a wider EMA label than they really have evidence base for, which inevitably leads to no added benefit in some patient populations. And in Germany, insurers are obliged to reimburse within that whole label, which ends up impacting the mixed price. If we move away from this mixed price calculation, we could see potentially higher prices achieved in narrow patient populations, but then the insurers will be able to restrict access to those patient populations. And another potentially big change is the possibility of wider contracting for preferred agents within patented drugs as well. And in 2015, there was a new law that was passed, the Act to Strengthen Provision in the Statutory Health Insurance System. And this law has really paved the way for the insurers to find alternative methods to the current indicative prescribing limits to encourage economic prescribing. And the pilot in Bavaria has really shown that what they do is essentially open up tenders where they have contracted agents, and then there are incentives for the physicians to prescribe those contracted agents. And we see this, if further sickness funds follow suit, this could impact those drug classes where you have multiple drugs with little differentiation competing really for these contracts. And taken as a whole, this potential Germany change and also changes in other countries really mean that there is a clear need to incorporate the reality of the global pricing and reimbursement environment in the forecasting, business development and licensing decisions. And what we sometimes hear from our clients in market access functions is that when they get consulted on these, their voice is not quite heard. There is still that expectation that a higher price can be achieved and by the reimbursement, and we really don't think that that's any longer the case.
So companies are actually struggling to sort of cope with some of these potential changes, that they have to address some of those issues that you're suggesting.
Yes, and keeping an eye on what the changes are in the environment, and also making sure that all the different functions within the company are tied together and communicating effectively.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. So, I mean, if we sort of think about, say, going back to the sort of webinar that we ran 5 years ago, at that time there was, as I say, there was concern about patent cliff. Sort of the market access issues were more of a European experience at that time. NICE was the one that everybody was talking about. But pipelines were not being replenished. There was a potential R&D deficiency or deficit within big pharma, and M&A was in fact the quick fix. In particular, companies acquiring sort of specialty pharma assets. Joe, how is that sort of shaped up?
Well, I think as a journalist, I often think about things in headlines, and if I had to think of a headline for 2015 M&A, it would really be that big pharma is back. Up until 2015, it really had taken a bit of a backseat because we've had things like the patent cliff, as you mentioned, and absorbing some rather large transactions. So we've really seen it be specialty pharma's party. It really since about 2012. Actually, and specialty pharma entered 2015 really, really strongly. We saw companies like Actavis, we saw Value Pharmaceuticals, Endo Pharmaceuticals all make large transactions earlier in the year, but really, really dropped off in the second half of 2012 as we saw that its debt levels reached, as a peer group, its debt levels reached more than 34%, which, just to give some kind of idea of concept, that's about 3 times as much as the rest of the industry. And so its ability to conduct these tools really diminished, and we saw big pharma obviously take over. I think if we're thinking of specialty pharma, the poster child for this was probably Valiant. We described them on a deal-making frenzy within Scrip, and it's really been on this frenzied deal making for several years before it ran into its own trouble with its drug pricing and private scandals that everyone's seen those headlines about. And its stock price actually dropped more than 60% over the last year, so we can see that confidence is also been affected. Ernst & Young, every year they publish a firepower index, and one of the authors on that noted that at one point during the year, Valeant was so over-leveraged that its debt of 32 billion exceeded its market cap of 30 billion. So we can just kind of see the kind of figures that we're talking about there. So we did see some record-breaking M&A activity. We're going to talk about the Pfizer-Allergan deal in a second, so I'm not going to talk about that one right now. But as I said, the patent cliff really did dominate the big pharma story for the last 5 years. But now we have seen this peer set, this big pharma peer set, slightly return to growth, as you alluded to at the beginning. We saw some really big deals from companies, again, Pfizer. Pfizer acquired Hospira for 17 billion, and AbbVie bought Pharmacyclics for 20 billion, and then Merck bought Cubist for 9.5 billion. So these are really, really huge figures. But it's not just big pharma that's been on the hunt for deals. Biotech have also put their money to work in some really big multi-billion-dollar deals. We saw Alexion pay 8.4 billion for Synergiva, Celgene for Receptos, Amgen committed 1.25 billion for Dazima. So we're seeing some really, really huge figures from both sides of biotech and pharma.
And in a lot of cases, so these are where you sort of see that, for example, the Pharmacyclics acquisition or the Cubist acquisition. It was where big pharma was really putting some firepower into certain franchises, whether that be Hep C or antibiotics, etc.
Yes, there's that narrowing of therapeutic focus again that we're seeing, as Ian was talking about earlier on. And Hospira, one again can sort of see what it was doing for Pfizer. But the deal with Allergan, is a kind of game changer, and I just wondered whether you could sort of give us some thoughts on is there really an appetite amongst pharma executives or executives at these top pharma companies for this real mega merger M&A activity, or is this Pfizer Allergan deal a real sort of black swan phenomenon that we know it's going to turn up, we weren't surprised it's going to turn up, but it's still going to be very rare? We're going to I'll talk about some of the thoughts from the pharma industry a little bit later on. But I think one of the main things that we've heard from some of the people that we've been talking to is they're more interested in things like asset swapping. Again, I hate to hammer home the point, but it's this therapeutic focus narrowing. So I don't think we'll see another deal like Pfizer Allergan for an awfully long time. I think it was the top ever healthcare deal in terms of amount, and I think the third largest deal ever made globally in the corporate environment. But if we talk about the Pfizer Allergan deal, obviously it's 160 billion. Everybody's seen the headlines, and it really kind of dwarfs the first 3 quarters of 2015 was 151 billion in M&A deals. Obviously, the last quarter that just blew everything else out of the water. So is it a win-win for both sides, Pfizer and Allergan? Well, with Pfizer, it beat its own record. It bought Warner Lambert for 90 billion in 2000. And obviously for Pfizer, we all know that tax is a huge part to play in this. It's now going to be domiciled in Ireland, and by 2017, it's going to pay about 18% in corp tax compared to 25% that it pays at the moment in the US. Yeah.
So if we look at that, this idea of sort of tax inversion, when Pfizer attempted to acquire AstraZeneca, like sort of the year before last, we, like our Pharma Intelligence and our Pharma Insight teams, we were among the first to actually question the business rationale for them to actually even try and do that beyond tax saving. And we correctly forecast at the time that the likely failure of that proposal. Is there anything in this deal beyond that more attractive tax rate that actually should have us thinking about the Pfizer Allergan deal as being a good one?
The Scrip's reporting on it has been fairly neutral. We haven't really come out on either side of the deal. I think one of the interesting kind of ripples that's come out of this is when we've been talking to some of the more active patient groups, and they've been saying to us that perhaps their confidence in companies such as Allergan perhaps has dipped slightly, because they always worry when they see these big corporate deals done for tax reasons. It's all about the, from a patient's point of view, it's all about the tax and the money. What about R&D? What about our drugs that you're supposed to be developing? So that's one of the really interesting side things that we've been keeping an eye on. Obviously, for Allergan, it's got huge implications. It's now going to get 70 additional markets for its products. But one of the side issues, one of the ripples, is looking at a chap called Brent Saunders, who was the CEO of Allergan, is now the president of Pfizer. He's shown himself to be a really, really shrewd deal maker, and somebody that has made wonderful headlines for us over on the insights side of things. Just to kind of give you an idea of the kind of deals that he's made since he's been at the top of this field, he's overseen about 152 billion in acquisitions and major divestitures between 2013 and 2050. So that's just 2 years. He's done things like he sold Bausch & Lomb to Valeant for 8.7 billion, and Forest to Actavis for 28 billion, and then as CEO of Actavis, he then bought Allergan for 66 billion, and then of course sold the company's generics business to Teva, 40 billion. So he's a really, really interesting character. Is he the next CEO of Pfizer? I'm not sure. Perhaps Ian Reid would have something to say about that. I know he's in his 60s now, is Ian Reid, but you never know if these personalities are going to align with the company's strategy. They both have a very similar acquisitive strategy. Obviously, Reid oversaw the 68 billion buyout of Wyeth in 2009. There has been slight anxiety amongst some of the people that we talked to as part of our kind of daily reporting, that perhaps Saunders isn't as committed to all stages of R&D as Pfizer traditionally has been. However, Scrip interviewed Saunders about 3 weeks before the Pfizer merger came out, and he absolutely reflected Pfizer's strategy of investing in early stage in-house research, and was very, very keen to make us aware of that, and we reported on that. So if we're thinking about tax inversion, which Irish companies should we look at, or should we keep an eye on to be acquisition targets? There are a couple that spring to mind, and there's a cardiovascular company called Amarin that's based in Dublin, as is an orphan drug company called Horizon, so we'll be keeping an eye on those 2 companies. But if we have a look at the wider industry, so outside of Big Pharma, we also have a CRO based there called ICON. Are we looking at perhaps a situation in the next couple of years where a large CRO, an even bigger CRO than ICON, such as Quintiles, maybe would come in and buy somebody like ICON, or maybe even with a large pharma come and buy ICON as its R&D arm, and then can domicile itself in Ireland that way. So that's just something that we're keeping an eye on as well.
Yeah, and of course, it's interesting though, you sort of talk about the commitment of Pfizer to R&D, because of course, they were one of the companies that actually has seen, between 2014 and 2015, 700 million drop in their R&D commitment. So that's probably about 10%. So, so one would actually question the mothership own commitment to research and development. And I seem to recall that was one of the issues about AstraZeneca, or the AstraZeneca acquisition, in terms of did they have the appetite to have that. So so to come back to my question, okay, so we know that Brent Saunders has been a very, very active kind of guy, and we've seen some of the other sort of specialty pharma guys. But with the pharma guys, it actually looks like they're shedding assets. So it comes out to the question: do these guys really have that kind of appetite for M&A?
Well, certainly already in 2016, we've seen Shire and Bexalta finalise their deal for 32 billion, which makes it the largest rare diseases company. So we're seeing that specialty side of it come through again. But if we look at some of the stories and some of the people that Scrip have been talking to and reporting on, especially at conferences like the JPM conference, we can report back to our readers on really kind of straight from the horse's mouth exactly what they think. I was at Novartis's results day back in January, and Joe Jimenez stood on stage and said, and I quote, "We're in charge of our own destiny. We're not going to be doing any really big deals. Other companies think they have to substitute for a small pipeline, but not Novartis, so we could kind of rule them out." But then we also have companies such as Sanofi. At JPM, Olivier Brandecourt told us that it would be rebuilding its oncology pipeline through M&A. So that's a company that's got the appetite for M&A in 2016. And J&J said they have the cash and the appetite for M&A. So that's two good things that make a good M&A deal. But then we have a company such as GSK. Their chief strategy officer, a chap called David Redfern, he told us that he's going to sit out of the M&A scrum. They're really just going to focus on the essence swap, the transaction that they did with Novartis, where they've got this much better balanced portfolio, so they can really focus on vaccines, consumer health, respiratory and HIV medicines. So we've got kind of two very different opinions and strategies towards that in 2016. Are we going to see more mega mergers in 2016? Well, I don't think we're ever going to see anything as big as the Pfizer deal. But certainly if valuations continue to come down and debt's still inexpensive, I don't see why not. That could trigger some activity. I think, like I said before, I think it's going to be more asset swaps, maybe reverse mergers or divestitures rather than actual proper mega mergers. And as I said, we're kind of seeing these therapeutic battlefields, companies trying to gather their balanced portfolios together so that they have exactly what they want going forward.
And I guess that the fact that the capital markets in recent years were really, really supportive of biotechs. Biotech companies could actually, basically stuff the coffers full of cash to sort of develop as much as they wanted to. Now that money is getting more tight to get, I guess that they are again sort of potentially the exit for investors in these biotech companies, or the ability to develop, might again, the balance of power might rest back with big pharma. I mean, have you guys got any sort of thoughts on that?
I think that some analysts that we've been talking to have said to kind of expect another 200 billion a year. So M&A deal making is going to be the same level as 2015, if not higher. I mean, obviously we have the external headwinds. We've got to think about, as Tijana alluded to, pricing pressures and some macroeconomic conditions. Of course, we've got things like generic threats and biosimilars coming in. So there's so much to look at in 2016. I think M&A is going to be very, very interesting to keep an eye on, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, and on the biosimilars front, I think we do potentially have another looming patent cliff where, in fact, some of the biologics. Although again, we've seen some of the CEO of AbbVie saying, "Oh, we're not worried about Humira." It's what, $14 billion. And
nothing to worry about.
Nothing. Yeah, some revenue should only to worry about. Okay, so as we sort of go forward, I mean the list of top pharmaceutical companies actually hasn't really changed. I think Gilead Sciences is the only company that has kind of like merged into, taken a position in the top 10 in recent years.
In our recent Scrip 100, Gilead went from number 21 to number 9, based on 2014 pharma sales. Its pharma sales actually rose by 130%, which is just ginormous.
And that was what? That was they went up that much. Is that between 2014 and 2015?
No, sorry, that's between 2013 and 2014.
Yeah, because I think that we've seen another big step up.
I'm really interested to see the
with Gilead. So I think Gilead's going to be probably even higher up. Does that mean that actually we might see the big biotechs all of a sudden start to? I mean, we've seen some deals with the likes of Amgen, etc. But can we actually see big biotechs actually starting to become big players in M&A activity?
I think so. I think definitely it's definitely something we're going to be keeping an eye on, and we'll be interviewing all the top strategists within biotech, so we'll be able to bring the latest strategic thinking to the readers.
Right. Okay. So I mean, the fascinating thing about this industry is that there's plenty of things going on. There's obviously plenty of things for us to report on and to analyse. I mean, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today. If you've got any further questions or comments, please email them to pharma@informa.com. As I say, you can also make comments on Twitter at the hashtag Scrip big Q little s, so Scrip QS. And it just leads me to thank my fellow panelists for their contribution to this webinar. And yeah, thank everybody for again listening, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.